last week. For more, let's bring in George Ferguson, senior airline analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence from our Princeton bureau, and Seth Kaplan, managing director for Airline Weekly in our Washington, D.C. bureau. George, I want to start with you. Ignoring this incident last week for a second, because we'll get to that. The story with airlines is that they're finally just really doing well. The cost structure, they're solidly profitable. Even Warren Buffett likes airlines these days. Does this report that we got from United, which is all pre this incident, confirm that airlines are doing pretty good?
Yeah, I mean, we're here at, I'd say, generational highs for their profitability. They're not as good as they were last year. Fuel costs were a bit higher in the quarter. We knew that. We know fuel costs will be higher through most of the year for airlines. But they're more profitable than they ever have been. I think there's a lot more investors looking at them because of that.
Have we reached peak profitability, though, Seth? I mean, I know that there's a statistic that shows that United, American, Delta, and Southwest combined own 85% of the market now versus 55% back in 2007. They survived 9/11. They survived the extra security costs, the intense security, the oil spike, all of that. Are they destined to not make as much money as they did, say, last year?
Well, they are already no longer living sort of in this alternate universe that they were living in for a couple of years, where they still had the revenue structure that they had back when fuel was very expensive, when capacity was very constrained, and yet they had the cost structure, the new cost structure of a cheap oil environment. Now, they've grown some. There are all kinds of international threats as well, low-cost carriers from Europe in particular. And so here we have airlines that are still, in almost any context historically doing very well, but doing less well than they were just in the last year or so.
George, I'm not even sure if we'd be having this segment if it hadn't been for the incident last week. Suddenly there's a lot of interest in airlines. So let's jump to that, because here's, people pointing out, they're like, oh, no one's going to boycott United because they don't really have that much choices in the first place. Scarlett pointing out the degree of consolidation in this industry. How much does brand really matter?
I mean, in airlines, I think people really usually go for the cheapest fare possible. And so in the near term, I think it'll affect bookings, but long term, passengers really go for the cheapest fare.
Well, if there is a boycott of United, and Seth, I'm thinking about the Asian markets in particular, since the passenger who was dragged off the plane was of Asian descent, what levers can the airlines pull, can United pull to increase revenue and profitability? Could it, for instance, sell more miles to credit card issuers and to hotels?
Well, and let's be clear. I mean, it's not like you're going to get on a United flight and it's going to be empty. This is not a black or white question of a boycott, truly. But if United does indeed need to discount more to fill its flights, that's an issue for United. I mean, look, embedded in those numbers, as you said, beat the street. But United reported a pre-tax margin of less than 2%. Delta last week was 9%. Okay, and look, some of this is just that United is a more seasonal airline, peaks more in the second and third quarters, but some of that is that Delta takes a revenue premium over United as well as American. It has a better reputation. And obviously what has just happened to United is not going to help to close that gap, to close the revenue deficit that it has. So in terms of what it can do, you mentioned the credit card sales and so forth. That's been a real help in terms of a big and stable revenue stream. But really what United needs to do is what it's been doing in more mundane ways, which is to continue to improve itself. Don't look now, but United is actually a much more reliable airline than it was a few years ago. The problem is that something like last week can really set it back in terms of the perception, catching up to the everyday reality that it is getting better in some important ways.
And here we have a chart of domestic passenger yields, speaking to exactly what you're talking about. Of the big airlines, Delta clearly the leader on this front, United Continental down at the bottom.
Right, and this chart really points to how the different airlines have absorbed their merger partners as well. George, when the UAL Continental merger was seen as kind of rocky, full of a lot of stumbles, a lot of culture mismatch, Delta and Northwest went off a lot more smoothly. Is the United Continental merger marriage a lot more streamlined now? Are we seeing the benefits now?
I think we are. I mean, it took a while for United to get their act together. I think Oscar Munoz has helped that as well. And so I think we're starting to see a much more coherent team out of United. A couple of years ago, you might get on a United flight and hear from the crew that they're either a United or a Continental crew. Now I don't hear that very often anymore. And I think one of the things that also helped was the contracts, pilot contracts, maintenance contracts that help smooth, I guess, some bad feelings with some nice pay raises.
Seth, the incident last week has raised, people talk about the practice of overbooking. Some people have called for some sort of regulatory changes regarding that practice, even though, of course, incidents like last week are extremely rare. Is that at all plausible that something like this could catalyze sort of a new regulatory review of the industry and cause changes that would impinge on profitability?
Well, look, it wouldn't be the first time. I mean, several years back we had those incidents of, lengthy tarmac delays. You'd have a plane stuck away from the gate for many hours without food and water, overflowing toilets, all that. And sure enough, there came the tarmac delay rule. Airlines kicked and screamed, but they sort of, Doug Parker, now CEO of American, said, hey, we did this to ourselves. This would actually be more harmful, if in fact they were to impose if DOT were to say you can't oversell flights anymore. But in small ways, if airlines could just dial it back, Delta offering all that money now up to $10,000 to make sure somebody volunteers instead of having to yank somebody from a flight. That's the kind of things that airlines can do to get ahead of this and try to avoid anything too punitive to them and from their perspective to their passengers.
All right, George Ferguson, senior airline analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence, and Seth Kaplan, managing partner for Airline Weekly. Thank you both very much.